In the heart of the Draknar Empire, a crisis unlike any other was unfolding. The Emperor, ruler of the mighty dragon-like species known as the Draknar, was facing a problem he could not solve with all his strength, wisdom, or military might. His heirs, the baby dragons, were growing increasingly unruly. These creatures, born of royal blood, were powerful beyond imagination. Yet they were also untamable. The Emperor had tried everything he could to tame them. From the fiercest trainers to the most skilled dragon tamers, none had succeeded. The dragon's fiery tempers, immense strength, and unpredictable abilities had sent many skilled individuals to the healer's chambers, injured or worse. The Emperor's council had warned him that if something was not done soon, the baby dragon's health would decline. They refused to eat, their powers seemed unstable, and they had become impossible to handle. The Draknar people were beginning to fear that the Emperor's legacy might be doomed. The royal bloodline was at risk of failure, and no one had a solution. The Emperor had always been a man of pride, but even he knew that his dragons, his future, were slipping through his fingers. "Summon the human nurse," the Emperor commanded, his voice heavy with frustration. The Emperor's empire had always seen humans as a lesser species, young, untested, and unpredictable. But despite the Draknar's superiority in strength and magic, the humans had proven to be remarkably clever, adaptable, and resourceful. Some humans had even managed to establish small colonies near the edges of Draknar space, thriving in ways that even the Draknar had not expected. And now the Emperor had heard whispers of one particular human, a nurse who was said to be able to understand creatures in a way no one else could. Her name was Elena. Elena had never imagined herself standing in the heart of the Draknar Empire, facing a challenge that could change the future of an entire species. When she had been asked to come, she had done so reluctantly. After all, who was she, a human nurse, to challenge the ancient traditions of the Draknar? But she had always been curious about the world of the dragons, and when the Emperor's messenger had arrived at her humble human colony, offering her the chance to work with the creatures, she had accepted. She believed she could help even if others thought it impossible. When Elena arrived at the royal palace, she was stunned by the grandeur of the place. It was vast and imposing, full of dark stone walls and towering spires that seemed to pierce the sky. The halls were lined with ancient statues and the air was thick with power. But Elena's focus wasn't on the palace's beauty. It was on the creatures that she was about to meet. The Emperor's throne room was unlike any other. The moment Elena stepped inside, she could feel the tension in the air. The baby dragons were housed in an enormous chamber beneath the palace, surrounded by thick walls of glass and steel. Despite the efforts of many tamers, the dragons had been kept in isolation. They paced around the room, their eyes glowing like embers and their wings rustled with power. They were creatures of fire and fury, and their every movement sent a ripple through the air. The dragons were beautiful, with shimmering scales that changed colors as they moved, from deep reds to fiery oranges and golden yellows. But they were also terrifying. Each dragon was massive, even in its infancy. Their eyes burned with the intensity of stars, and their sharp claws could tear through stone. These dragons weren't like the tamed creatures of legend. They were wild, unpredictable, and full of raw, untapped power. Elena's first task was to observe. The dragons were clearly distressed, but she could see something in their behavior that the others had missed. These creatures were not simply unruly. They were frightened. They were surrounded by expectations they didn't understand, in an environment that was far too confining. They weren't wild because they wanted to be. They were wild because they had no choice. No one had taken the time to understand them as individuals. As Elena watched them, she began to form a plan. These dragons were not monsters, and they were not beyond saving. If she could reach them on a deeper level, if she could show them trust and respect, perhaps they could be calmed. But first she had to get close. The dragons roared as Elena approached their enclosure, their cries filled with a mix of fear and anger. The other trainers stood back, too afraid to try anything. They were used to commanding, to imposing order. But Elena knew that was not the way. The dragons needed kindness, understanding, and patience. She could feel their power thrumming in the air around her, but she stood her ground, speaking softly, her voice calm and steady. "Hey there," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I'm not here to hurt you." The dragon's eyes fixed on her, glowing brighter as she stepped closer. The heat in the room seemed to intensify, and Elena felt a bead of sweat trickle down her neck. But she didn't back away. She had a job to do. One of the dragons, a small but fiery creature with scales of deep red and gold, stepped forward. His eyes met hers, and for a brief moment Elena could see past the rage and fear. There was something else there, curiosity. A flicker of trust, though faint, had begun to shine through. "It's okay," she whispered again, lowering her hand to her side. "I'm here to help. I'm not like the others." The dragon studied her for a long moment before letting out a low growl. It wasn't threatening, but more of a cautious warning. Elena smiled. That was progress. The trainers, who had watched in silence, were now whispering amongst themselves. They had never seen anything like this. Most had been sure the dragons would attack the human on sight, as they had done with others. But Elena had made a breakthrough, even if it was small. She turned to the Emperor, who had been watching from a distance. His face was unreadable, but there was a flicker of something. Hope, perhaps. "We can do this," Elena said confidently. "But it will take time." The Emperor nodded, though there was still skepticism in his eyes. "Do what you must, human," he said. "But if you fail, we will have no choice but to take other measures." Elena nodded, knowing full well what was at stake. But she was not afraid. She believed in her method, in her approach. The dragons would not be tamed by force. They would be tamed by trust, and that was a lesson no one had yet learned. The next morning, Elena stood in front of the glass walls that separated her from the dragons. The enormous chamber was still, the air thick with a strange kind of tension. The baby dragons lay scattered around, their glowing eyes fixed on the human who had entered their domain. Their bodies were like living flames, each scale shimmering in the light that filtered through the thick glass. Elena had not slept well the night before. She had spent the hours after her first encounter with the dragons thinking, planning, and researching. She knew that taming these creatures was no simple task, but she had a feeling deep down that she could help them. If only they would let her. She had learned in her years of nursing that patience and understanding were often the best medicine. But how would she apply this to creatures so powerful and wild? She needed to find a way to connect with them, to show them she wasn't a threat. The Emperor's bloodline depended on these dragons, and yet no one seemed to understand what they really needed: time, care, and trust. As Elena stepped into the chamber, she noticed that the dragons were awake, but none of them were moving. Their large eyes followed her every step, their pupils narrow slits, watching with the kind of intensity that would make anyone else uneasy. Most creatures would have charged at her by now, but not these dragons. They were different. One dragon in particular caught her attention. It was the smallest of the group, with shimmering red and gold scales that caught the light like fire itself. Its wings were still small, tucked neatly against its back, and it had a fierce but somewhat sad expression on its face. It was Scifi, the youngest and most difficult to tame. The other dragons seemed to keep their distance from him, as if afraid of his temper. Elena's heart softened as she approached the glass wall. Her hand pressed lightly against the cool surface. She could feel the heat radiating from Scifi, even from this distance. His eyes narrowed as he watched her, but there was something in his gaze that made her believe he wasn't as wild as everyone thought. "Hello, Scifi," she said softly, her voice calm and steady. "I know you're afraid. I can help you. But you have to trust me." Scifi's body stiffened at the sound of her voice. He let out a low growl, one that shook the air with a quiet rumble. Elena stepped back slightly, keeping her movements slow and gentle. She didn't want to frighten him more. "I'm not here to control you," she continued, her words soft but firm. "I'm here to understand you. You're not alone, Scifi. You never have been." The dragon's growl softened into a low hum. Elena could see that he was listening, even if he didn't fully understand. She had seen this kind of behavior before with injured animals, a mixture of fear, pain, and confusion. They didn't know who to trust, and so they chose to lash out to protect themselves. But Scifi was not a mindless beast. He was smart, too smart to just attack without reason. She could tell that if she was going to get through to him, she needed to start small. Elena turned her attention to the other dragons. Vera, a larger dragon with silver scales and green eyes, was watching her carefully. She seemed calm, but there was an underlying wariness in her gaze. Vira was highly intelligent, but had been kept isolated from the others due to her cautious nature. She had witnessed her siblings' struggles and had learned to distance herself from them. "Vera," Elena whispered, turning her eyes toward the larger dragon. "I see you too. You don't have to be afraid. I can help you understand what's happening." Vera tilted her head slightly, her long, sharp snout moving closer to the glass. There was something about the way she studied Elena that made the nurse feel like she wasn't just speaking to a dragon. It felt as if Vera was trying to make sense of her words, to measure whether Elena was truly trustworthy. Elena decided it was time to take a step further. She needed to make an effort to show these creatures that she wasn't just another figure of authority trying to dominate them. No, she had to show them that they could control their own future with her help. She turned to one of the attendants who had been assigned to monitor the dragons. "I need to get inside their enclosure," Elena said, her voice steady. The attendant raised an eyebrow. "Are you sure?" "The dragons, I know." Elena cut him off. "I need to be close to them, I'll be careful." The attendant hesitated but then nodded. "Very well, but remember you are on your own if something happens." Elena nodded back, determined. She was about to face the dragons head-on, and she wasn't going to back down. She stepped forward, and the thick doors to the chamber slid open. Immediately the heat from the dragons' bodies washed over her, but she kept her posture calm and collected. Cypher's eyes were locked onto her the moment she entered the room. He was watching her closely, his body tensed, his tail flicking with agitation. The other dragons looked on, their attention split between Elena and the little red dragon. Elena approached Cypher slowly, keeping her movements deliberate. She didn't want to startle him, but she needed to make sure he knew she was there to help. She knelt down to his level, making herself appear smaller and less threatening. She could see the tension in his posture, his claws digging into the floor. "I'm not going to hurt you," Elena whispered, her voice soothing. "You don't have to fight me." Cypher growled lowly but didn't move. Elena didn't push forward. Instead, she stayed still, waiting. Her eyes never left his, and she could see the conflict in his gaze. He wanted to trust her, but something was holding him back. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Cypher took a slow step toward her. Elena didn't move, her heart pounding in her chest. The dragon's fiery breath seemed to burn the air around her, but she remained calm, offering him the space he needed. Cypher's eyes softened, and he stopped just a few feet away from her. For a brief moment there was silence, and then, an unexpected gesture, Cypher let out a soft huff of air, as if letting go of some of his tension. Elena smiled softly, her heart swelling with a mixture of relief and triumph. She wasn't just treating an animal, she was making a connection. The other dragons, watching from the sidelines, seemed to take notice. Vera, the largest, stepped forward cautiously, her large wings rustling slightly as she moved closer. Elena could see the curiosity in her eyes. It wasn't much, but it was a start. A breakthrough. And Elena knew that this was just the beginning. The baby dragons had a long way to go, but with patience, trust, and understanding, they could be tamed, not by force, but by kindness. Over the next few days, Elena spent every moment she could in the dragon chamber. The dragons, Cypher, Vera, and the others had grown used to her presence. They no longer reacted with immediate aggression when she entered the room. Instead, their fiery eyes watched her with an almost cautious curiosity. It was a start, and Elena was determined to keep the momentum going. She quickly realized that taming these dragons wasn't about force or dominance. That was the mistake the other trainers had made. The dragons weren't wild. They were scared. They had been raised in isolation, surrounded by too many expectations, too many rules. It was no wonder they acted out. They didn't understand their place in the world. Elena's job was to show them that they didn't need to be controlled. They needed to be understood. Elena's first breakthrough came with Cypher. The young dragon, though small, was fiery and unpredictable. He had a sharp temper and an even sharper mind. But unlike the others, he seemed to trust Elena in his own way. He watched her closely, his bright golden eyes always tracking her every move. He was intelligent far more than anyone had realized, and Elena could see that he was trying to understand her. One afternoon she stood before him, trying something she hadn't yet attempted. "I know you're frustrated," Elena said softly, her voice calm. "You're not the only one. But you don't have to carry this alone, Sci-Fi. I can help you if you let me." Sci-Fi growled lowly, but this time it wasn't an angry growl. It was a sound of hesitation. He took a few steps toward her, his massive claws scraping against the stone floor. Elena didn't move. She remained still, speaking in gentle tones. "You don't have to fight me," she whispered. "I'm not here to control you. I want to help you understand." To her surprise, Sci-Fi paused, his head tilting slightly as if considering her words. There was still a wariness in his eyes, but there was something else now. A flicker of understanding, of trust. Slowly, he stretched out one of his wings, the great leathery surface nearly touching the ground. Elena took a deep breath. This was it. She reached out and, for the first time, gently touched the tip of his wing. Sci-Fi tensed but didn't pull away. Instead, he let out a soft huff of air, a strange, almost relieved sound. "You're okay?" Elena whispered. "You're safe." Sci-Fi didn't pull away, and for a brief moment Elena felt the warmth of his trust. He wasn't fully relaxed, he probably never would be, but this was progress. Real progress. Meanwhile, Vera, the largest of the dragons, observed from a distance. Her silver scales glistened in the light, and her green eyes followed every move Elena made. Vera had been the most cautious of the group. She was intelligent and perceptive, but she was also terrified of what might happen if she let herself get too close to the humans or the other dragons. Her isolation had made her hesitant to trust anyone, even her siblings. But Elena noticed that, like Sci-Fi, there was something beneath the surface, something waiting to break free. Elena decided that it was time to address Vera's fears. She moved slowly toward the larger dragon, who watched her every step. "I know you're scared," Elena said gently, her voice soothing. "But you don't have to be. I'm not here to hurt you. I'm here to help you." Vera's wings fluttered nervously, but she didn't move away. Instead, she studied Elena, her large, intelligent eyes taking in every detail. Elena could see the hesitation in Vera's posture. The dragon wanted to trust her, but something held her back. Elena took another step forward, this time sitting down on the cold stone floor. She didn't approach Vera, but she remained within sight, giving the dragon space. She understood that it wasn't just about getting close physically. It was about creating an environment of trust. "I'm not like the others," Elena continued, her voice calm. "You don't have to be afraid of me." Vera's head turned slightly, her eyes flickering toward the nurse. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, the dragon lowered her head closer to the ground as if considering Elena's words. Elena smiled, her heart swelling with hope. She wasn't giving up on these creatures. She knew that they could be tamed, but it would take time and patience. The days went by and Elena continued working with the dragons. She carefully studied each one, learning their individual traits and personalities. Sci-Fi was clever and fast, but also impulsive. Vera was cautious but intelligent, and she responded best to calm, reassuring gestures. Each dragon had its own unique qualities, and Elena knew that her approach had to be just as unique. She began creating small, safe challenges for the dragons, ones that would help them build confidence and control over their powers. She would hide food in different corners of the room, encouraging them to use their fire to melt obstacles or their claws to open hidden doors. It wasn't about forcing them to act. It was about helping them learn to trust themselves, to trust their abilities. Sci-Fi, in particular, showed great promise. He was quick to catch on, and his fiery breath was becoming more controlled. Elena worked closely with him, pushing him to develop his abilities without overwhelming him. She would guide him through each challenge, watching carefully to ensure he never felt pushed too hard. One evening, Sci-Fi stood in front of a large wooden door that Elena had placed in the center of the chamber. His eyes glowed with concentration as he focused on the door, his tail flicking back and forth. Elena stood a few paces away, watching him carefully. "Go ahead," she encouraged him. "Use your fire." Sci-Fi hesitated for a moment, his wings fluttering nervously. Then, with a deep breath, he let out a controlled stream of flame that engulfed the door. The wood crackled and burned away, leaving a pile of ash behind. Sci-Fi looked up at Elena, his eyes wide with surprise. Elena clapped her hands together, a smile spreading across her face. "Well done, Sci-Fi. You did it." Sci-Fi's chest puffed out with pride. He had never before felt so in control of his abilities. The fire, once a source of uncontrollable rage, was now something he could manage. He wasn't just a wild beast, he was a dragon with power and purpose. Vera, too, had started to come around. While she was more reserved than Sci-Fi, she had begun to trust Elena in her own way. She no longer flinched at every step Elena took, and had even allowed the nurse to come closer. The dragons were changing, and Elena was beginning to realize just how important her role was. She wasn't just taming beasts, she was shaping the future of the Draknar Empire. But the work wasn't finished. It would take time, patience, and more trust, but Elena knew that she was on the right path. With each day, the dragons were becoming stronger, more confident, and more willing to face the world they had once feared. And Elena was right there with them, every step of the way. Elena had been working with the dragons for nearly 2 months now, and the changes were undeniable. Sci-Fi, once the most temperamental, had learned to control his fiery breath, using it with precision. Vera, who had been distant and wary, was now interacting with the others, even showing signs of affection toward Elena. The dragons had come a long way, but there was still work to be done. Elena knew this journey was far from over, yet a sense of accomplishment filled her as she watched the dragons slowly open up. But outside the dragon chamber, things were beginning to shift. The Emperor had been keeping a close eye on Elena's progress, and though his view of the dragons had softened somewhat, his skepticism still remained. There were whispers in the palace about his growing doubts. Some of his advisors believed that the dragons were too unpredictable to be left to their own devices. The Draknar Empire, after all, had long depended on strength and order. The dragons, even as royal heirs, were seen as a potential risk, and some of the more conservative members of the court were not happy with the changes Elena had brought. One such figure was Lord Azrak, a powerful noble and commander of the Draknar military. He had always been a staunch believer in tradition and control. To him, the idea of allowing the dragons to develop freely without strict discipline was nothing short of madness. He had never agreed with Elena's methods, and as her influence grew, so did his opposition. Lord Azrak had long thought of the dragons as tools to be wielded in battle, weapons that would secure the future of the Draknar Empire. He had no patience for softness or empathy. His focus was on strength and obedience, qualities that, in his mind, the dragons lacked. To him, Elena's approach was not only misguided, it was dangerous. He had begun to rally support among the other nobles, questioning the Emperor's decision to trust a human nurse over the tried and tested methods of traditional training. Elena was unaware of the growing tension, lost in her work with the dragons. She had made progress with them, but she still knew they were not ready to face the outside world. There were still moments of doubt, still moments when Sci-Fi or Vera would show signs of fear, still moments when their powers felt out of control. But she wasn't discouraged. Every small step forward was a victory in her eyes. She just needed more time. One evening, as Elena was preparing to meet the dragons for their daily session, she was suddenly summoned to the palace. A messenger had come with urgent news. The Emperor wanted to see her. When Elena arrived, she found the Emperor in the grand throne room, surrounded by his most trusted advisors. His face was unreadable, his posture stiff. Lord Azrak stood beside him, his expression cold, his eyes filled with suspicion. Elena's heart skipped a beat. She knew something was wrong. "Elena," the Emperor began, his voice heavy with authority. "We need to talk." Elena felt a chill run through her. She bowed respectfully. "Your Majesty, what is it?" The Emperor's gaze never left her. "There are concerns among the court about your methods. Lord Azrak believes that the dragons are becoming too unpredictable. He believes that the Empire cannot afford to leave them to their own devices any longer." Elena felt a lump in her throat. She had known this day might come, but hearing it out loud made it all the more real. She took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. "I understand the concerns, Your Majesty," she said, her voice steady. "But the dragons are not wild beasts. They have been misunderstood, and their abilities have been suppressed by fear and control. I believe that if we continue to work with them, if we allow them to develop freely, they will become the leaders the Empire needs." Lord Azrak stepped forward, his voice sharp. "The dragons are not meant to lead, they are meant to serve. They are powerful, but they are also dangerous. They cannot be allowed to roam free. They must be trained to fight to protect the Empire, If we do not act now, they will be a threat, not an asset. Elena's heart sank. She knew that Lord Azrak had no interest in understanding the dragons as individuals. He saw them only as weapons. But she had to keep her composure. The future of the dragons, of everything she had worked for, depended on it. Your Majesty, Elena said, standing her ground, I know that the dragons have power, but they are not weapons to be wielded. They are creatures of intelligence, of emotion, of untapped potential. If you force them to become soldiers, you will break them. They need time to understand who they are, not to be trained like tools. The Emperor's gaze flickered between Elena and Azrak. There was a tense silence in the room, and for a moment Elena wondered if she had gone too far. But then the Emperor spoke. I hear your words, Elena, he said, his voice softer now, though still firm. But the Empire cannot wait forever. I cannot risk the dragons growing beyond our control. Azrak nodded sharply. The time for patience has passed. We must act before it's too late. Elena knew that the Emperor was torn. He wanted to trust her, but his fear for the Empire's future clouded his judgment, and Lord Azrak's influence was not something to be taken lightly. I understand, Your Majesty, Elena said quietly, but I ask for more time. Let me continue working with them. Let me show you that they can be more than just weapons. They can be the future of the Empire. For a long moment, the Emperor said nothing. The room was thick with tension, the air heavy with uncertainty. Finally, he spoke, his voice low. I will give you 1 month, he said. If you do not show significant progress by then, I will take other measures. Elena bowed her head, her heart racing. Thank you, Your Majesty. I will not let you down. With that, she left the throne room, her mind in turmoil. 1 month. She had 1 month to prove that the dragons were capable of more than what Lord Azrak and his supporters believed. If she failed, the dragons would be taken away from her, and perhaps even subjected to the very training methods she had worked so hard to prevent. The weight of the task ahead settled on her shoulders as she made her way back to the dragon chamber. The dragons were waiting for her, unaware of the storm brewing around them. She knew that she couldn't do this alone, not with the pressure mounting from all sides, but she was determined. The dragons had come so far. They were no longer the wild, uncontrollable creatures they once were. They were beings of incredible strength and intelligence, and Elena would do whatever it took to prove that to the Emperor. The stakes had never been higher, but Elena was ready for the challenge. The days had turned into weeks, and with each passing day, Elena's bond with the baby dragons grew stronger. She could see the change in them, in the way they moved, the way they trusted her. Scifi, the once stubborn and fiery dragon, had become more controlled. His flame no longer roared uncontrollably, but instead burned with purpose. He was becoming a creature of power, not rage. Vera, who had been cautious and fearful, now showed a different side of herself, a dragon who was thoughtful and wise. She had begun to communicate with Elena more openly, no longer afraid to trust the human who had shown her kindness. Elena had spent countless hours with them, patiently guiding them through each new challenge, helping them unlock their hidden abilities. The dragons had learned to work together, forming bonds that no one had thought possible. Where once there had been fear, there was now hope. But despite the progress, there was still much to be done. The Emperor, who had watched from a distance, had not yet fully embraced the idea of allowing the dragons to grow on their own terms. He still saw them as tools, as weapons for the future of the Empire. He couldn't shake the belief that they had to be trained to be perfect warriors, to be strong and unyielding. Elena knew that the dragons were capable of much more than just being weapons. They were creatures of wisdom, power, and emotion. But she also understood that the Emperor would never see them that way, unless he saw them for what they truly were. And so she decided it was time to show him. One morning, Elena was called to the Emperor's palace. She had received a summons, and though she had expected this moment to come eventually, she couldn't help but feel a flutter of nerves. She had been working so hard with the dragons, and now it seemed like the time had come to make her case. When she arrived in the Emperor's grand throne room, she found the great hall as imposing as ever. The towering stone walls, the gleaming statues of past rulers, and the massive throne at the far end, all of it seemed to demand respect. The Emperor sat at his throne, his gaze cold and calculating as always. Elena, the Emperor said, his voice deep and commanding, I have watched your work with the dragons. There has been some progress, but I remain unconvinced. These creatures are too unpredictable, too dangerous. They must be trained properly. Elena stood tall, her heart pounding, but she knew she had to stand firm in her beliefs. She had spent enough time with the dragons to know that they were more than just beasts. They were a part of the future of the Draknar Empire. But they needed the freedom to grow, to learn, to find their own path. Your Majesty, Elena began, her voice calm but filled with conviction. The dragons are not tools to be used. They are living creatures, each with their own strengths and weaknesses. They are not here to serve as weapons in a war. They are here to lead, to grow, and to shape the future of the Empire in their own way. If you continue to treat them as mere instruments, you will break them. The Emperor's eyes narrowed, his fingers tapping slowly against the armrest of his throne. He was not used to being challenged, especially not by someone as young and seemingly insignificant as Elena. But there was something in her words that made him pause. He had seen the dragons' progress, but he had been too focused on their potential as warriors to fully understand what they had become. And what would you suggest? The Emperor asked, his voice laced with skepticism. Elena took a deep breath. I suggest you allow the dragons to grow in their own time, at their own pace. Let them choose their own path, and they will become more than just powerful creatures. They will become wise leaders. Leaders who can guide the Empire, not through fear, but through strength, wisdom, and compassion. There was a long silence in the throne room as the Emperor considered her words. He had always believed in the might of the Draknar, in the power of control, and the discipline of training. But Elena had shown him something different. She had shown him that the dragons were not just raw power to be harnessed. They were a force of nature, and they deserved to be treated as such. I have seen the change in them, the Emperor finally said, his voice quieter now. But they are still too young, too unpredictable. That is true, Elena replied, but that is why they need time. You cannot force them to be what they are not. They are not your soldiers, Your Majesty. They are your heirs. Your legacy. The Emperor's gaze softened for a moment, and Elena could see the weight of his responsibility bearing down on him. He was not an unfeeling ruler. He cared deeply about the future of the Empire, but he had been blinded by his own fear, his own need for control. I will consider your words, Elena, the Emperor said, his voice steady once again. But know this, the future of the Empire rests on the strength of my bloodline. If the dragons fail, so too will the Empire. Elena bowed her head. I understand, Your Majesty. But I believe the dragons will succeed not because of force, but because of the trust and bond they have with one another. And with the Empire. They are not your enemies. They are your greatest allies. With that, Elena left the throne room, her heart racing. She had spoken her mind, but the Emperor's decision was still uncertain. She had no idea what would happen next, but she knew one thing for certain. The dragons were not going to be tamed by force, and neither would the future of the Draknar Empire. As she made her way back to the dragon chamber, she found the baby dragons waiting for her, their bright eyes filled with curiosity. Scifi, the smallest but now the most confident, approached her first, his tail swishing with excitement. Vera followed closely behind, her green eyes gleaming with understanding. Elena smiled and knelt down, reaching out to touch their wings. You've come so far, she said softly. I'm so proud of you. Scifi let out a soft, contented growl, his eyes warm with affection. Vera gave a quiet, almost imperceptible nod, her trust in Elena now fully formed. Elena could feel the connection between them, the bond that had been forged through time, patience, and love. These dragons were not just creatures to be controlled. They were beings of great power and potential, and they would shape the future in ways no one could yet understand. As the days passed, the dragons continued to grow stronger. They were no longer the untamable beasts they had once been. They had become something greater, something that would lead the Empire into a new era of peace, strength, and understanding. And Elena, the human nurse who had seen them not as weapons but as individuals, would always be there to guide them. The future of the Draknar Empire, once uncertain, was now brighter than ever.